Hey, welcome to Restoration. My name is Matt. So glad you could join us on this Shabbat or whatever day you're watching this message. We are glad that you're hanging with us as we continue through our series, Blood Brothers, the story of the sons of Jacob. Every family has a story: betrayal, jealousy, favoritism, silent pain. The good news is God tells his story through a family that is probably more complicated than yours or mine. So today is part 12 of Blood Brothers, and it is called Fruitful in the Land of Affliction. Last week, Joseph was quickly lifted from the pit, and today we finish chapter 41. We discover something profound. God doesn't just lift Joseph out of the pit, he makes him fruitful in the very land of his oppression. Now, we talked about last week how Joseph's plan seems to settle Pharaoh's spirit. And in verse 38 of chapter 41, it says, "Then Pharaoh said to his servants, 'Can a man like this be found, one in whom is God's spirit?'" But this is the first time in Scripture that the phrase Ruach Elohim is used, the Spirit of God, not for performing miracles, not for prophesying, but for wisdom, discernment, and the ability to administrate a nation through crisis. And Pharaoh recognizes the Ruach Elohim, the Spirit of God. He doesn't just see a smart manager in Joseph. He sees a man whose wisdom is different, other. Potiphar saw it. The warden of the prison saw it. And now the world's most powerful man confirms it. Joseph is a clear vessel for God's presence. In verse 39, it says, "Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one as discerning and wise as you.'" I mean, who else could do what Joseph suggested with his plan? Clearly not the other Khartoumim, the wise men and the scribes, because they couldn't even see what this man filled with the Ruach Elohim could see. And so Pharaoh continues and he says, you will be over my house, and all my people will pay homage to you, and only in relation to the throne will I be greater than you." And this is super cool because in Hebrew, the word for house is habayit. And in reverse, those letters spell teba, which is the word for ark. Now, Noah's ark saved the world from too much water. Pharaoh's house is going to save the world from not enough water. Both are forms of decreation. Joseph is a new Noah here. He's building a grain ark to save the remnant of Israel and the nations. We'll also see the same pattern again in Exodus when a baby named Moses is placed in a basket. But the Hebrew word for basket is the word for ark, which saves him from the Nile River. Noah's ark preserved the seed of humanity and the animal kingdom to restart the world. Pharaoh's house preserved the seed of Abraham so that they could grow into a nation and save the Gentiles, the nations. In both cases, the saving vessel wasn't just for the man himself. It was for the preservation of a remnant that would carry God's plan forward to the whole world. In Genesis 41, verse 41, it says, "Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'See, I appoint you over the whole land of Egypt.'" Now, this is Joseph's third exaltation. He's exalted in Potiphar's house, made overseer of the whole household. Then he's exalted in the prison and made manager of the prison. And now all of Egypt, he's second in command of the empire. Each time Joseph rises to the top, but this time it's public, permanent, and political. Verse 42, "Then Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his hand, put it on Joseph's hand, clothed him in fine linen garments, and put a chain of gold around his neck." Now, this chain of gold is no just regular chain of gold. It was a specific decoration in Egypt known as the gold of honor. This Shebu collar was made of a heavy circular gold beads, was bestowed in a public ceremony to signal the king's total trust. And because the Egyptians view gold as the flesh of the gods, this collar signaled that Joseph now carried Pharaoh's own divine authority. And the fine linen garments are a prophetic reversal in the story. Joseph's brothers stripped his robe and threw him in a pit. Potiphar's wife grabbed his garment and shamed him. Now he's clothed for glory. The fine linen here, the Hebrew word shesh, is the exact same word used later in the Torah for the sacred garments of the high priest. Joseph is being clothed in purity and honor that prefigures the tabernacle, and the sacrificial system. Verse 44, it says, Pharaoh also said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, yet without your permission, no one will lift up his hand or his foot in the whole land of Egypt. In a way, what Pharaoh is saying is, you will be seen by the people as me, or at least the image of me. And when people see Joseph, they'll treat him as if they have seen the Pharaoh himself. It's a hyperlink back to the creation, where man and woman are made in God's image to care for the Garden of Eden. When Egypt sees Joseph, they see Pharaoh's authority. When Joseph acts, Pharaoh acts. But here's the deeper reality. When the nations see Joseph, they encounter the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob working through him, even if they don't realize it. Tim Mackey captures what's happening perfectly when he said that even in the middle of the world's undoing, a wise image of God who fears God can save life in the midst of death all around. That's Joseph, and that's the pattern that the scripture builds off of Joseph. And as we'll see, that's the calling of God's people in every generation, in every place. Now, Joseph's not only lifted up, but he's given an Egyptian identity. Verse 45, it says, Then Pharaoh named Joseph Zapanath Paneah and gave him Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, as his wife. And Joseph went out in charge of all the land of Egypt. Now, this Egyptian name means the deity said he will live. It's funny that Pharaoh names him God says he will live. Because how many times has Joseph died in the text? And Joseph marries Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, from the city of On. And this city was a major temple city. It was actually the center of Egyptian sun worship. And Asenath comes from Egyptian royal and priestly lineage. This isn't just a political arrangement with a minor family. This is top-tier Egyptian society. Joseph is now fully embedded in Egyptian culture. He's given an Egyptian name and an Egyptian wife, an Egyptian authority, an Egyptian identity. And he doesn't look like a Hebrew slave anymore. He looks like an Egyptian prince. So Joseph was in charge of the land of Egypt. And that raises an important question for us in the world that we live in. Can you be faithful to God while embedded in an ungodly system? Joseph says yes. Daniel will say yes in Babylon. Esther will say yes in Persia. You don't have to separate from the world to serve God's purposes in it. You have to remain anchored in who God is and who you are in him, even when everything around you changes. Joseph changes his name, his clothes, his language, his job, but his identity remains rooted in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In verse 46, it tells us that Joseph is 30 years old when he began serving as representative of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And he went from Pharaoh's presence and passed throughout all the land of Egypt. Joseph has been in Egypt for 13 years. He was sold into slavery at 17. He spent 11 years in Potiphar's house and in prison. 2 more years forgotten after interpreting the chief of drinkers' dream. Now suddenly, he's second command in all of Egypt. 13 years of formation, 13 years of obscurity, 13 years of being refined in the pit. And at 30 years old, he becomes the image of Pharaoh to the people of Egypt. And the writer of Genesis writes in verse 49, So Joseph stored up grain like the sand of the sea, vast amounts, until he stopped keeping record because it was beyond counting. This phrase in Hebrew, like the sand of the sea, is a direct hyperlink to the promise that God made to Abraham in Genesis 22. In Hebrew, the word for seed, zera, refers to both grain and descendants. Joseph isn't just counting wheat. He's preserving the covenant. He's the mechanism by which Abraham's seed provides life to all the families of the earth. And he stopped keeping record because it was beyond counting. This same idea is of the grain not being numbered is the exact language used to describe the future of Israel in Genesis 32:12. If the grain runs out, the seed of Abraham dies. By storing uncountable grain, Joseph is quite literally storing up the future of the covenant. God is building an ark, these storehouses, before the family even arrives. And Joseph wasn't just counting bags of wheat, he was counting the promises of God. There is not only fruitfulness in the land of Egypt because of Joseph, but we find out that there's also fruitfulness in the womb of Joseph's Egyptian wife in verse 50. They had 2 sons, had been born to Joseph before the year of the famine came. Notice the timing. Before the famine begins, God provides personal restoration through the pattern of 2. 2 dreams sent him into exile. 2 dreams got him out of prison. 2 dreams lifted him to the throne. Now he has 2 sons. Just like Judah has 2 sons, Perez and Zerah, which signaled a redeemed future for a broken father. Joseph's 2 dreams will later, 2 sons, Joseph's 2 sons will later become the 2 half tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. They represent a prophetic double portion for Joseph's family line. And look at the names that he gives his children. In verse 51, Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh, because God had caused me to forget all my trouble and all my father's house. Manasseh means causing to forget. And on the surface, this sounds like healing, and I think in part it is. God has brought Joseph through the worst of the pain. The bitterness has lifted. The daily ache has subsided. But listen carefully to what Joseph says. God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. Not just the hardship, but the whole house. His father, his family, his brothers, Benjamin, the people who wounded him. Joseph thinks he's done. He thinks the chapter's closed. He's moved on. He's got a new name and a new family and a new life. And he's going to forget Egypt was ever exile. He's going to forget that he could forget that he's a Hebrew. He may forget Jacob and forget his brothers and forget the dreams that he had. Sometimes what we call forgetting is actually avoidance. And sometimes what we call moving on is actually closing the door on reconciliation. Now, Joseph has every right to be done with his brothers. What they did was evil, unforgivable by human standards. But God doesn't just heal us so that we can move on and forget. He heals us so that we can move towards reconciliation. Friends, there's a difference between healthy grieving, processing pain, releasing bitterness, trusting God with justice, and premature closure, trying to forget so we don't have to face the possibility of reconciliation. Joseph thinks he's done grieving, but he hasn't grieved with hope for restoration. He's grieved with the goal of burial. He wants to bury the memory, bury the trauma, and bury the family that betrayed him. But God gently and sovereignly knows that what Joseph tries to bury, God intends to resurrect. And God is not finished with this family. In fact, 2 years into the 7 years of famine, those very brothers are going to show up at Joseph's doorstep looking for food. And while he unknowingly waits, he experiences fruitfulness in what he names his second son, verse 52. And the second he named Ephraim, because God has made me fruitful in the land of my oppression. Ephraim means fruitful or doubly fruitful. And this name carries a different tone. Joseph acknowledges God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. He doesn't say my former affliction. He says my affliction, present tense. Egypt is still, in some sense, a land of affliction. It's not home. It's the place where he was trafficked, enslaved, falsely accused, imprisoned, and forgotten. But God has also made him fruitful there. Not despite the affliction, not after escaping the affliction, but in the land of his affliction. Joseph is holding 2 realities at once. This place wounded me, and this place is where God has blessed me. And we live in the same tension ourselves. We too can be fruitful in the land of affliction. Your Egypt, your land of affliction, may never stop being the place that hurt you, but it can also become the place where God makes you fruitful. Now, write this down if you're taking notes. The pain doesn't erase the fruitfulness, and the fruitfulness does not erase the pain. Both are true at the same time. The pain doesn't erase the fruitfulness, and the fruitfulness doesn't erase the pain. So Joseph has two sons in Egypt: Manasseh, forgetting my past, I'm forgetting my past, and Ephraim, I'm fruitful in my pain. But what Joseph doesn't know yet is that forgetting isn't actually the goal. Grieving? Yes. Releasing bitterness? Of course. Trusting God with justice? Yes. But forgetting the people that God might still redeem? Not a chance. In Genesis 42 to 45, as we continue in this series, we're going to see Joseph's brothers show up. And Joseph will have to wrestle with whether he really has forgotten them or whether God has been preparing his heart through grief and fruitfulness for the reconciliation that he never imagined possible. The lesson for us, and this is so important, is don't rush to forget when God might be preparing you for restoration. We have to grieve betrayal. We have to lament injustice. We have to release bitterness. But we also have to stay open to the possibility that the people who wounded you one day might stand before you desperate and broken, and God might ask you to be the vessel of their salvation. That's what's coming for Joseph. He just doesn't know it yet. So in verse 53, it says, then the 7 years of famine and abundance in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine started to come, just as Joseph has said. So there was famine in all the lands, but in the whole land of Egypt there was bread. Listen to how important this is. Everywhere in the world there was famine, except in the whole land of Egypt there was bread. Because the Lord was with Joseph, and the Lord used Joseph as a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to be a blessing to the nations with bread. God made the house of Pharaoh and the nation of Egypt an ark to save his people Israel and the nations from famine and death. And of course, it will also become a place of affliction for Israel. And God will free us from our oppression and mark us as his own and make covenants with us, which is the reason why we celebrate Passover every year. Genesis 41 and verse 56. The famine was all over the entire land. So Joseph opened up all that was among them and sold grain to Egypt. And then the famine became severe in the land of Egypt. Yet the whole world came to Egypt to buy grain to Joseph, because the famine was severe in the whole world. No, this is cosmic language in Genesis. The famine isn't regional, it's global. And the whole world comes to Joseph for salvation. Do you see what's happening in the text? The place of Joseph's suffering becomes the source of the world's salvation. He was brought down to Egypt against his will. He was brought down into prison unjustly. And now all the earth comes down to Egypt to find life through him. God redeemed the very place of Joseph's affliction and turned it into a distribution center for the salvation of the Gentiles. And of course, hidden in the words of this text, the whole world is Joseph's brothers. Canaan is starving too. Jacob is desperate, and he sends his 10 sons to make the journey down to Egypt to buy grain. Joseph thinks he's forgotten them, but they're coming. And God has been preparing both sides for a reunion that neither Joseph or his brothers could have ever imagined. Joseph's story doesn't end with grain in storehouses. It becomes a pattern for how God's people live under foreign powers in lands of affliction. Daniel follows the pattern in Babylon. Esther follows it in Persia. And the earliest followers of Yeshua follow it in the Roman Empire. Now, decades after Yeshua's death and resurrection, the Apostle Peter was writing to Jewish followers of Yeshua scattered across the Roman world. They were far from Jerusalem and far from home, and they're faithful, misunderstood, and being slandered for what they believe. And like Joseph in the pit, they are wondering if obedience is worth it. So Peter begins his letter to them, and he says to the sojourners of the diaspora in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. The word means temporary residence, foreigners living in a place that is not their real home. Peter is naming their reality. They belong, but not fully. They serve, but without surrendering identity. Their exile is not accidental. And the second word he uses here is the diaspora. It means scattering. It's drawn from agricultural language. When a farmer scatters seed, he isn't losing it, he's planting it. And the Torah and the prophets anticipate Israel being scattered all over the world. And Peter is saying that the diaspora is not a disaster, it's a distribution. Like Joseph in Egypt, God is not waiting for exile to end before he works. He works through the exile. That's why Peter says to these Jewish believers all over Asia, he emphasizes conduct and visibility. 1 Peter 2, verse 12, he says, keep your conduct honorable among the Gentiles. Then they will speak against you. While they speak against you as evildoers, they may, from noticing your good deeds, glorify God in the day of visitation. I mean, this is Joseph in Genesis 41. Pharaoh doesn't give his life to the God of the Hebrews, but he does see wisdom, integrity, and life flowing through Joseph. Peter is saying to these Jewish believers, followers of Yeshua who are being persecuted all over the Roman Empire, your faithfulness under pressure is not wasted. It's grain stored for a famine that you may not even know is coming. And Peter also spends a lot of time in this letter reframing suffering. In chapter 4 and verse 12, he says, loved ones, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal taking place among you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. Suffering is not abandonment. It's often the soil of fruitfulness. Joseph suffered not because he was unfaithful, but because he was faithful. And the same pattern follows God's people in every empire. Peter anchors everything he's saying to these Jewish believers all over the Roman Empire in resurrection hope, in a living hope through the resurrection of Yeshua. Exile is not the final word. Affliction does not get the last chapter. As with Joseph, faithful obedience in exile leads to restoration. And Peter ends his letter with a promise. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 10. After you've suffered a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you into his eternal glory in Messiah, will himself restore, support, strengthen, and establish you. Peter's saying to them, and he's also saying to us, the Messiah who suffered greatly in death and came back to life 3 days later will see to your restoration himself. So whether it's a grain silo in Egypt, a synagogue in Asia Minor, or your life today, God calls his people to be faithful and fruitful in exile. And friends, look at me and listen. Don't rush to forget when God may be preparing restoration. And don't wait for your Egypt to end before you become a blessing. I'm going to say those again, and I want you to stop doing whatever you're doing on your other devices. And listen, don't rush to forget when God may be preparing restoration. And don't wait for your Egypt to end before becoming a blessing. You have to name your Manasseh. the grief God has carried you through. And you have to name your Ephraim, the fruit that God is growing right now. And you have to stay open, because the God who's with Joseph in Egypt and with the Jewish followers of Yeshua in the Roman Empire is still at work in this land of affliction and fruitfulness. I love you guys, and I hope you'll continue with us through Blood Brothers, and we'll see you next week.